The truth cannot stay hidden forever. The sun dipped below the streets of Sacramento, painting the sky in hues of orange and soft purple. The golden light reflected off the windshields of passing cars, merging with the rhythmic hum of a city wrapping up a long day. Robert Kalos adjusted the air conditioning in his car, relishing the cool breeze after a demanding day at work. The soft melody playing from the radio helped him unwind as he merged into the evening traffic. Then came the sound. A police siren blared from behind him. A familiar noise, but this time it was directed at him. The flashing blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror, casting flickering patterns onto his face. Robert furrowed his brows but remained composed, easing his car toward the curb. As the vehicle rolled to a stop, he lowered his window, hands resting firmly on the steering wheel, waiting. Behind him, the patrol car's door swung open. Officer Mark Yike stepped out. A man in his mid-30s, sharp haircut, a gleaming badge pinned neatly to his chest. His stride carried the weight of authority, the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. Approaching the driver's side, his hand hovered near his belt, eyes scanning Robert with calculated intent. "License and registration," Yike demanded, his voice firm but not outright hostile. Robert didn't argue. He calmly reached into the glove compartment, retrieved the vehicle registration, then pulled his wallet from his jacket and handed over his license. Throughout the process, Yike's gaze never wavered, scrutinizing him as if searching for something beyond a simple traffic violation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Yike asked, leaning slightly into the window, his tone edged with curiosity. Robert shook his head slightly. "Not sure, but I assume you'll tell me." "You didn't come to a full stop at the red light?" Yike replied, though there was a faint hesitation in his voice. Robert frowned, recalling the moment before he was stopped. He was sure he had slowed down almost to a halt, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave a small nod. "Understood. I thought I had stopped in time. But if not, I accept that." Yike didn't return his license. Instead, he continued studying him, allowing an uneasy silence to stretch between them. "You're not from around here, are you?" Yike asked, flipping the license between his fingers. Robert blinked, noting the shift in tone. This was no longer just a routine stop. "I moved to Sacramento a few months ago. My address is on the license," Robert replied evenly, but Yike wasn't interested in the response. His eyes remained locked on Robert, as if calculating his next move. "Where are you headed in such a rush?" "Home," Robert answered simply. Yike tilted his head slightly, suspicion evident in his expression. "Do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" Robert arched an eyebrow. "No." Yike didn't seem convinced. He folded the documents but, instead of handing them back, tucked them into his chest pocket. "Step out of the car." Robert held his gaze. "Is there a particular reason for this?" "Just a routine check," Yike responded, his tone unwavering. A second passed. Robert knew his rights. He could refuse, but he also knew how these situations often escalated if stretched too far. With a measured breath, he unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out, ensuring his hands remained visible. Yike took a step back, scanning him from head to toe. The tailored suit, polished shoes, everything about Robert spoke of professionalism and precision, but to Yike, none of that seemed to matter. "Turn around, hands on the hood." Robert blinked. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" "Just procedure," Yike reiterated, though this time there was a trace of uncertainty in his voice. Robert sighed but complied. He didn't resist as Yike patted him down, the officer's hands moving with deliberate force, almost as if daring him to react. But Robert remained composed, refusing to give him that satisfaction. Finally, Yike stepped back, visibly displeased. "You're clean," he muttered, as if the outcome disappointed him. Robert turned around, his expression calm. "I know." For the first time, a flicker of unease passed over Yike's face. He was used to controlling these encounters, but this time, something felt off. Robert's unshaken composure unnerved him, and he didn't like it. Seconds passed in silence. Then, with deliberate slowness, Robert reached into his jacket pocket. "I think it's time you knew who I am." Yike's stance tensed slightly, wariness creeping into his features. "What are you doing?" "I'm retrieving my badge," Robert replied, pulling out a leather wallet and flipping it open. A polished badge gleamed under the streetlights. "Robert Kalos," he stated evenly, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. "Director of Sacramento Internal Affairs." Yike's face drained of color. The arrogance, the control, the smug satisfaction, gone in an instant. Now it was his turn to be scrutinized. And in that moment, Yike understood. His career had just taken a devastating turn. The truth cannot stay hidden forever. The Sacramento sky turned deep purple as the sun set, bathing the city in a warm golden glow. The day was winding down, and the steady stream of cars crawled through the streets, headlights flickering like ribbons of light stretching into the distance. Robert Kalos leaned back slightly in his seat, lowering the volume of the radio, savoring the brief moment of peace after a long, exhausting day. All he wanted was to get home, leave the pressures of his office behind, and enjoy the rare tranquility he allowed himself. But his journey was interrupted by the flashing lights behind him. The red and blue reflections filled his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a police siren. Robert frowned slightly, but his first reaction wasn't panic. It was a calm, calculating stillness. He smoothly pulled over, keeping his hands on the steering wheel, his cold gaze watching the figure approaching in the mirror. Officer Mark Yike. A man in his mid-30s with a sharp haircut, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he had absolute authority. His hand rested casually near his belt as he leaned toward the driver's side window, eyes scanning Robert like a predator assessing its prey. "License and registration," Yike ordered, his tone not overtly aggressive, but dripping with an unspoken arrogance. Robert didn't argue. He reached into the glove compartment, retrieved his documents, and handed them over without breaking eye contact. "You know why I pulled you over?" Robert met his gaze evenly. "Not sure, but I assume you'll tell me." Yike took in a slow breath, tapping the stack of documents against his palm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the red light." A slight lift of Robert's brow. "I slowed down nearly to a stop, but if I didn't fully, I understand." Yike studied him for a moment before flipping the license in his hand, scanning the details. "You're not from around here, are you?" Robert tilted his head slightly. "Moved to Sacramento a few months ago. The address is on my license." But Yike didn't seem interested in the answer. He was searching for something. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Robert didn't flinch. "Home." Yike stepped back just a fraction, as if to take in the full picture of the man before him. "Step out of the vehicle." Robert remained silent for a moment before responding. "Is there a particular reason for that request?" Yike smirked. "Routine check." Robert knew exactly where this was going, but he had no intention of escalating the situation. He exhaled slowly, unbuckled his seatbelt, and stepped out of the car, his hands resting loosely at his sides to avoid any misunderstandings. Yike sized him up, his gaze drifting from Robert's tailored suit to his polished shoes, lingering just long enough to imply something unspoken. Turn around, hands on the hood. A flicker of irritation crossed Robert's face, but he complied. Yike moved in, his hands running over Robert in an unnecessary, almost provocative search. His touch was rougher than necessary, pausing in places where it didn't need to, as if trying to provoke a reaction. Robert remained still, unmoved. When Yike finally stepped back, his expression twisted slightly, as if disappointed. "You're clean." Robert turned, his cold gaze unwavering. "Of course." Yike hesitated, then let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You seem pretty confident." Robert tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here. Respect is." Yike's eyes narrowed. "You think you can say whatever you want?" Robert held his gaze. "I only state facts." The air between them crackled with tension. Then, slowly, Robert reached into his suit pocket. "I think it's time you knew who I am." Yike's posture tensed, his instincts flaring. "What are you doing?" Robert pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open. A polished insignia gleamed under the streetlights. "Robert Kalos," he said, voice calm but commanding, Director of Sacramento Internal Affairs. The color drained from Yike's face, the arrogance, the sense of control, gone in an instant, and for the first time, it was Yike who stood under scrutiny. This time, he was the one being judged. Sacramento, a sweltering September evening. The golden hues of sunset stretched across the crowded streets of Sacramento, bathing the city in warm shades of orange and purple. The traffic crawled forward, headlights flickering like fireflies as the city wound down from another relentless day. Robert Kalos adjusted his rearview mirror, his gaze drifting over the cars beside him. A long day was nearly over, and all he wanted was to go home, pour himself a glass of wine, and forget about everything. But peace was short-lived. Red and blue lights suddenly flickered in his mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a police siren. Robert frowned slightly, his exhaustion shifting into quiet annoyance. He knew he hadn't broken any traffic laws, but situations like this were all too familiar. Inhaling deeply, he pulled over, rolled down his window, and rested both hands on the steering wheel. From the patrol car behind him, Officer Mark Yike stepped out. His stride was confident, almost arrogant, like a man who believed he had absolute control over these streets. His short-cropped hair and gleaming badge gave him an air of authority, but his eyes held something else, something more calculating. "License and registration," Yike ordered, his voice sharp, leaving no room for debate. Robert remained composed. He reached into the glove compartment, retrieved his documents, and handed them over. Yike flipped through them, his gaze scanning each detail like he was searching for something, anything. "You know why I pulled you over?" Robert met his eyes without hesitation. "Not sure, but I assume you'll tell me." Yike scoffed lightly, flipping the license in his fingers. "You didn't come to a complete stop at the red light." A slight arch of Robert's brow. "I slowed down and nearly stopped. But if I was wrong, I understand." The answer was polite, measured, impossible to argue with. And yet Yike didn't look satisfied. A flicker of irritation passed through his expression. "You're not from around here, are you?" Robert tilted his head slightly. "Moved to Sacramento a few months ago? The address is on my license." Yike nodded absently, but it was clear he wasn't really listening. His eyes flickered over the car's interior before settling back on Robert. "Step out of the vehicle." A quiet pause. Robert remained still for a few seconds before speaking evenly. "What exactly have I done to warrant that?" A smirk tugged at the corner of Yike's mouth. "Just a routine check." Robert knew exactly where this was going. With a slow, steady breath, He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Careful, deliberate. Hands on the car, Yike ordered. A breath through the nose, controlled but firm. Robert complied. The pat-down was unnecessary, borderline invasive. Yike's hands lingered, his touch deliberate, stretching the moment longer than it needed to be. But Robert didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give Yike the satisfaction. When the search was over, Yike stepped back, his jaw tightening. "You're clean." Robert turned, his gaze cool and unwavering. "Of course." Yike studied him for a second, then let out a low chuckle. "You seem pretty damn confident." Robert tilted his head. "Confidence isn't the issue. Respect is." The smirk on Yike's lips faded. His eyes narrowed. "You think you can say whatever you want?" Robert held his gaze. "I only speak the truth." The air between them crackled, tense and heavy. Then, slowly, Robert reached into his suit pocket. "I think it's time you knew who I am." Yike tensed. "What the hell are you doing?" Robert pulled out a leather badge holder and flipped it open. A gleaming insignia caught the streetlight. "Robert Callos," he said smoothly, his voice calm yet commanding. "Director of Sacramento Internal Affairs." Yike's face went pale, every ounce of confidence drained from his body. This time, he wasn't in control, and for the first time tonight, he was the one being scrutinized. The truth can't stay buried forever. The Sacramento sky deepened into shades of violet as Robert Callos entered the Office of Internal Affairs. In his hand was a thick file, pages filled with reports on Officer Mark Yike's conduct. The events of the previous night still lingered in his mind. What should have been a routine traffic stop had quickly turned into a test of power and prejudice. But this time, Robert wasn't just another man intimidated by a badge. He was the one overseeing those who wore them. Seated at his desk, he opened the file and skimmed through the reports. Yike's name wasn't new to the system. Complaints of unprofessional conduct, unjustified stops, and clear patterns of abuse of power. Everything was there, buried beneath layers of unresolved paperwork. A knock at the door. "Come in," Robert said, his eyes still scanning the documents. The door creaked open, and Linda, his assistant, stepped inside, clutching a fresh stack of files. "Good morning, Director Callos," she greeted, though there was tension in her voice. Robert finally looked up. "What is it?" She hesitated before placing the new documents on his desk. "It's the internal activity report for last month, and..." She paused. "And..." Linda took a breath. "Chief Daniels wants to see you, right now." Robert wasn't surprised. After last night's incident, he knew conversations would have to be had. But the real question wasn't about the meeting itself. It was about its outcome. Chief Daniels's office was spacious, lined with framed awards and commendations, a shrine to his decades of service. As Robert entered, Daniels was already seated behind his desk, his sharp eyes studying him like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Sit down, Callos." Daniels gestured to the chair across from him. Robert took his seat, placing the thick file onto the desk. Daniels leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers interlocked. "I heard about last night." "Did you?" Robert replied evenly. "I know what you did, and I know what you're planning to do." Daniels continued. "But let's be practical. One traffic stop isn't a reason to dismantle an entire system." Robert smirked slightly. "No, but it's proof that something is already broken." He tapped the file. "This isn't an isolated incident, Daniels. This is a pattern. And you know that." Daniels' jaw tightened. "So, what do you want?" "I want a full review of the department," Robert said bluntly. "Not just Yike. Every officer, every procedure. We can't keep pretending everything is fine." Daniels let out a short, humorless laugh. Do you even realize what you're walking into, Kalos? You think the city council will back you on this? You think the other officers will just stand by while you dig through everything? I don't work for their approval, Robert replied, voice unwavering. I work to make sure that the badge they wear actually means something. Silence. Daniel stared at him, weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. You're putting me in a difficult position, Kalos. I'm just doing my job. A beat of silence passed between them. Then, slowly, Daniels nodded, as if accepting an unavoidable truth. Fine, he said. You have my approval. But be ready. There will be backlash. You're not making any friends with this. Robert picked up the file. If I wanted friends, I wouldn't have taken this job. He stood heading toward the door, but before leaving, he turned back, his gaze steady. We can keep ignoring this, he said, or we can fix it. I choose the latter. Daniel said nothing as Robert walked out, but one thing was certain. Change was coming, and for those who had abused their power for far too long, there would be no turning back. The night Sacramento began to change. The sun had fully set, leaving Sacramento bathed in the deep hues of night. Streetlights cast their warm yellow glow over the bustling streets, where the city's rhythm refused to slow. In his office at the Department of Internal Affairs, Robert Kalos sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the file in front of him, Officer Mark Yike. The encounter from the night before still played vividly in his mind. It hadn't just been an unjustified traffic stop. It had been a glaring symptom of a much deeper problem, a culture of prejudice and abuse of power that had festered within the police force for far too long. But this time, Robert wasn't just another driver pulled over for no reason. He was the man who had the authority to decide Yike's fate, and, more importantly, the future of the system itself. The door to his office swung open. Linda, his assistant, stepped in with a serious expression. Chief Daniels wants to see you immediately, she said, placing another file onto his desk. He doesn't look happy. Robert exhaled, closing the report in front of him. He had known this meeting was inevitable. Chief Daniels' office was spacious, decorated with plaques, commendations, and framed photos from years of service. When Robert stepped inside, Daniels was already seated behind his desk, fingers interlocked, eyes sharp. Sit down, Kalos, Daniels instructed, his voice measured. Robert took a seat, placing the thick file onto the desk between them. I assume you've heard about last night, he said evenly. Daniels let out a humorless chuckle. Heard? My phone hasn't stopped ringing. He leaned back slightly. Why don't you tell me what happened? He pulled me over without cause, escalated the situation without justification, and, Robert's eyes locked onto Daniels, made assumptions that had nothing to do with the law. Daniels studied him. You think it was bias? Robert tilted his head. I don't think. I know. A heavy silence settled between them. Then Daniels sighed, resting his elbows on the desk. What do you want? Robert pushed the file forward. A full investigation into Yike and a comprehensive review of the department. Daniels' expression hardened as he stared at the file, as if it were a ticking time bomb. You realize what you're asking for, don't you? I do, Robert replied without hesitation. It means we stop sweeping this problem under the rug. Daniels clenched his jaw. You're putting this department under public scrutiny. Robert let out a short laugh, devoid of amusement. If we don't fix this ourselves, someone else will do it for us. And when that happens, it'll be far worse. Daniel stared at him for a long moment before finally leaning back, his eyes filled with reluctant contemplation. Fine, he said slowly. I'll authorize the internal investigation. But you should know, Kalos, This won't be easy, and you won't have many allies. Robert rose to his feet, adjusting his collar. I don't need allies, Daniels. I need change. With that, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor. The real fight was just beginning, but this time he was ready. The night the battle began, the sun had long disappeared behind Sacramento's towering buildings, leaving a lingering twilight stretching over the bustling streets. Inside his office, Robert Callow sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the computer screen displaying Officer Mark Yike's record. He had spent the entire afternoon combing through past complaints, unjustified traffic stops, reports of aggressive behavior, and citizen grievances, all of which had either been dismissed or buried in bureaucratic silence. The system had shielded officers like Yike for far too long, and Robert knew that if he didn't act now, nothing would ever change. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Linda, his assistant, peeked in. Chief Daniels is waiting for you in the conference room. Robert nodded, inhaling deeply before rising from his chair. This meeting would determine his next move. The conference room was spacious, but the tension inside was suffocating. As Robert entered, Chief Daniels sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Beside him were 3 senior officers, including the department's legal counsel. Take a seat, Callows, Daniels said, his voice measured. Robert pulled out a chair and sat down, resting his hands on the table, his gaze unwavering. Can you explain why I received a formal request for a department-wide investigation over a single traffic stop? Daniels asked, his tone laced with exasperation. Robert didn't flinch. This isn't about just one traffic stop. It's about a deeper issue. A culture that enables officers to abuse their authority without consequence. One of the senior officers let out a frustrated sigh. Are you saying the entire department has a problem just because of one officer's actions? Robert tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but razor-sharp. No, I'm saying that an officer like Yike can continue operating unchecked because the system has protected him. Daniels folded his arms, narrowing his eyes. How far do you plan to take this? As far as necessary to make sure it doesn't happen again, Robert answered without hesitation. A brief silence settled over the room before Daniels exhaled heavily. Do you realize the kind of fallout this will cause? Not just internally, but with the public, the media, and the people who have a vested interest in this department staying the way it is? Robert leaned forward, pressing his palms against the table. I don't care about those interests. I care about whether we can regain the public's trust. If we lose that, we've already failed. Daniels held his gaze for a long moment before finally leaning back, his expression shifting to reluctant acceptance. You're serious about this? Completely. Another pause, then slowly, Daniels nodded. All right, you have my authorization to proceed with the investigation, but understand this, Callows. You're walking a dangerous path. Not everyone wants change. Robert stood, giving a curt nod. I'm not doing this to please anyone. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the conference room. As he moved down the long hallway, he knew the real battle was only beginning. But this time, he wouldn't stop until everything changed. The battle for accountability. The night had settled over Sacramento as Robert Callows left the police headquarters, his footsteps echoing against the stone pavement. His meeting with Chief Daniels had gone exactly as expected, tense, filled with warnings, and carrying an unspoken message. If he continued to dig into Mark Yike and the corruption within the department, he would be stepping on powerful toes. Robert wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time he had faced resistance for doing the right thing. But this time, he knew failure wasn't an option. Allowing an officer like Yike to operate unchecked would send the wrong message. That power could be abused without consequence. He opened his car door, slid into the driver's seat, and took a deep breath before starting the engine. Tonight was not a night for rest. He needed more evidence, not just against Yike, but against the entire system that had shielded him. The next morning, Robert entered his office, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, but he barely had time to take a sip. Linda, his assistant, was already waiting outside, her face tense with urgency. "Mr. Kalos, I think you need to see this." She handed him a thick file along with a USB drive. "I went through the system and found several complaints against Yike that were never properly addressed. And this," she said, pointing to the USB, "is footage from his patrol car's dash cam the night he stopped you." Robert held her gaze for a moment before nodding. "Good work, Linda. I'll review it now." He stepped into his office, closed the door behind him, and plugged the USB into his computer. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy footage illuminated by the glow of streetlights. Yike's voice filled the room, cocky, condescending, and unmistakably prejudiced. The way he escalated the situation without cause, the underlying malice in his tone, it was all there, undeniable and damning. Robert clenched his fists. This was exactly the proof he needed. The investigation spread through the department like wildfire. By the afternoon, an emergency meeting was called, bringing together the highest-ranking officers, including Chief Daniels. "Kalos, do you really want to take this that far?" one senior officer asked, his expression skeptical. Robert met his gaze without hesitation. "This was never just about a single traffic stop. It's about accountability and transparency." Daniels tapped his fingers on the table, studying him. "So, what's your plan?" Robert pulled a file from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "I propose the immediate suspension of Officer Mark Yike while the investigation continues. We also need to reopen past complaints against him and conduct a full review of the department's disciplinary system." A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers exchanged glances, clearly uneasy. Daniels remained silent for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "All right, but be ready, Kalos. You just declared war on a system that has spent decades resisting change." Robert didn't flinch. He simply nodded. He knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but if the goal was to build a police force that truly served the people, then this was the only path forward. The truth cannot stay hidden forever. Robert Kalos stepped out of the police station, inhaling deeply as the cool night air brushed against his face. The tense meeting with Chief Daniels had confirmed what he already knew. His investigation into Mark Yike was rattling the system. The skeptical glances, the whispered conversations, the silent resistance from veteran officers, everything pointed to one truth. He was on the right path. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Linda. "Boss, I just received an anonymous call. Someone sent in a file on Yike. I think you need to see this immediately." A surge of adrenaline coursed through Robert's veins. Without hesitation, he got into his car and drove straight to his office. When his computer screen lit up, a video began to play. It was security footage from a street camera. Not from his own traffic stop, but another incident from a few weeks ago. A black man had been pulled over by Mark Yike, and this time there was no controlled procedure, no professionalism. Yike's voice was sharp, dripping with hostility. "I told you not to show up around here again. People like you don't belong." The man raised his hands, trying to explain, but Yike shoved him onto the hood of his car with unnecessary force. Robert clenched his fist. This was irrefutable proof, not just of Yike's abuse of power, but of the deep-seated injustice that had been allowed to thrive within the department. He picked up his phone. Linda, call Chief Daniels. We need an emergency meeting first thing in the morning. By morning, the large conference room at the police department was packed. Some officers sat silently, others exchanged uneasy glances. When Chief Daniels walked in, his expression was unreadable. "Kalos, I hope you have a good reason for this." Robert said nothing. He simply pressed play. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Some officers lowered their heads. Others looked visibly stunned. At the far end of the room, Mark Yike sat frozen, his face paling as he realized every eye in the room was now on him. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Yike?" Daniel's voice was heavy. Yike opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew this was the end of the road. "You are hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation," Daniels declared. Silence filled the room as two officers stepped forward, removing Yike's badge. As he was let out, Robert caught the simmering rage in his eyes. But it didn't matter anymore, because justice had been served. That evening, as Robert stepped out of the police station, he noticed a man waiting near the entrance. "You're Robert Kalos?" the man asked, his voice slightly hesitant. Robert nodded. "My name's Michael. I'm the man in the video you showed today." A cool breeze drifted between them. Robert studied the man for a long moment before asking, "Are you okay?" Michael gave a small smile. "I never thought someone would stand up for me. I just wanted to say, thank you." There was a weight in those words, something deeper than gratitude, something that spoke of years of being ignored. "You don't need to thank me," Robert said. "We all deserve to be treated fairly." Michael nodded, a flicker of newfound belief in his eyes. As Robert walked away, he knew this fight wasn't over. But tonight, he had proven that change was possible. Justice is not given, it is demanded. Robert Kalos' story is more than a battle between right and wrong. It is a reminder that silence enables injustice. Change does not come from passive acceptance, but from those who dare to stand up, question, and act, even when facing opposition. A broken system cannot fix itself if no one challenges it. Justice is not an abstract concept. It is the direct result of action. It is a system held accountable by people unwilling to let corruption thrive. It is a badge worn with integrity, not as a shield for abuse. In a society where trust is fragile, it is the actions of individuals like Robert that rebuild faith, protect the vulnerable, and most importantly, inspire others to fight for what is right. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.